The battle had ended at dawn. Harry Potter sat in the Great Hall and did not sleep. The bodies had been moved. He did not know who had done it or when exactly, only that at some point the Great Hall had ceased to be a battlefield and become a room again, the same room where he had eaten 1,000 meals, where he had watched the enchanted ceiling shift from autumn to winter, where he had once in his first year looked up and thought, I am here, I made it. He was sitting slightly apart from everyone else, his back against a pillar, and he was not crying. He had expected to cry. He had cried earlier, he knew. There had been a moment after that he couldn't quite bring back with any clarity, only the sense of weight and the sound of Ginny's voice. But now he was not crying. He was existing in the specific silence that follows the thing you have spent your whole life building toward, and finding, to his complete surprise, that he did not know what silence was supposed to sound like. He did not decide to leave the Great Hall, he simply found at some point that he was no longer in it. The corridors were quiet in the way they only were at the very edges of the night, before the castle had fully understood what had happened and begun to process it. Portraits slept in their frames or watched him pass without speaking, which was a mercy. The staircases moved for him without being asked. He climbed without particularly meaning to, his feet finding the route they had taken 100 times before, and it was only when the stone gargoyle stepped aside, without a password, without requiring one, as though it understood this was not a night for passwords, that he realized where he had been going. The headmaster's office was empty, or nearly. He sat down not in the chair in front of the desk, but on the floor, his back against the wall, which felt more honest than the chair. The room was grey in the early light coming through the high windows. Around the walls, the portraits of former headmasters and headmistresses dozed in their frames, or pretended to. None of them spoke. He was grateful for that too. The Elder Wand lay across his palm. He had already decided what he would do with it. He had decided before the last spell was cast, or perhaps in that long terrible walk through the forest, or perhaps years before that in some way he couldn't name. He would return it to Dumbledore's tomb, today, this morning, as soon as there was a this morning to speak of. He wanted his own wand, he wanted ordinary. He turned the Elder Wand over in his hands and tried to remember what ordinary felt like. He found he could not quite access it. He had been in a state of emergency for so long, 7 years at minimum, longer if he counted the years of not quite knowing, the years of being someone marked and hunted before he understood what marking and hunting meant, that the absence of emergency felt like a different kind of emergency. His body did not know what to do with the silence. It kept waiting. He let it wait. After a while he looked up. Dumbledore's portrait watched him from behind the desk, not with the knowing smile, not with the particular expression Harry had spent 7 years trying to interpret, that mixture of warmth and calculation and something he had never been able to name and now suspected had been grief all along. The portrait's expression was simpler than any of those. It was something that looked in the grey early light very much like relief. Harry looked at him, the portrait looked back. They nodded at each other. That was sufficient. Neither of them had anything to say that words were adequate for, and they had both, in their different ways, always known that. He became aware of Ginny sitting beside him at some point he could not afterwards identify. She had a gift for that, for arriving in his vicinity so quietly and so naturally that there was no moment of arrival, only the sudden fact of her presence. She did not ask if he was all right. He was grateful for this. The question would have been inadequate in a way he would not have known how to explain without sounding strange. And Ginny, who almost never asked questions she already knew the answer to, seemed to understand this without being told. She simply sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder touched his, and looked at the same middle distance he was looking at. After a while, Harry looked down at her hand in his. He could not have said precisely when that had happened either. He looked at her hand in his and thought, This is what I was doing it for, not an idea, not a symbol, not the abstract shape of a better world, although those things were real and had mattered and would matter again, but specifically this, the specific weight of her hand, the way the grey light came through the high windows, the fact of being here, the two of them in the morning after. Specific things like this. They went outside as the sun was rising. He did not plan to go outside. He stood up because his body needed to move after sitting still for so long, and Ginny stood up because he did, and they walked out through the great oak doors and down the stone steps and across the grounds, and at some point Harry realized that the world was still there, still entirely itself. The lake was the lake. The forbidden forest was the forest. The sky was beginning to lighten along the horizon in the way that skies do regardless of what has happened underneath them, indifferent and magnificent and entirely unimpressed. He was alive. The world was alive. There was nothing in front of him, nothing he was building toward, nothing he needed to survive, no map of what came next. For 17 years the shape of his future had been determined by a prophecy he had not asked for. For 17 years he had been living inside someone else's story about what he was and what he was for. And now there was only the morning, and the lake, and the girl beside him, and the particular quality of light that came just before sunrise when the sky could not yet decide what color it intended to be. He had expected this to feel like loss. He found to his considerable surprise that it did not. Not knowing what came next felt, for the first time in his life, like a gift. He was going to find out. Chapter 1, Something to Ask You. October 1998. Harry Potter had been carrying the ring for 3 weeks. He had bought it on a Tuesday afternoon in Diagon Alley when he was supposed to be buying a new set of robes, which told him something about the state of his mind at the time. He had been walking past a jeweller's window, a small, slightly dusty establishment between Madame Malkin's and a shop that sold enchanted telescopes, and had stopped without any intention of stopping. He stood on the pavement looking at the display, and then, as if following instructions from some part of himself he did not have ready access to, he had gone inside. The jeweler was an elderly witch with a measuring tape that moved of its own accord, and an expression that suggested she had seen many nervous young men come through her door and was not going to let on how obvious he was being. She brought out several cases. He looked at diamond solitaires in modern settings and thought no. He looked at emerald clusters and thought not quite. And then she brought out the estate pieces from the back room, and he saw the sapphire in old silver, and something in his chest settled with an almost audible click. It looked like it had always been going somewhere. It looked like it had simply been waiting to arrive. He bought it, he walked out into Diagon Alley with the small box in his pocket, squinting in the afternoon light, feeling terrified and completely, absolutely certain simultaneously. It was not, he reflected, an unfamiliar combination. He had operated under those conditions for most of his life. He did not buy the robes. He went home to the Burrow and sat in the garden for an hour and watched the gnomes attempt to undermine the fence posts, which they did with a persistence and stupidity that he found oddly comforting. 3 weeks later, the ring was still in his pocket. It had become a kind of ballast. He was aware of its weight at all times, at dinner, during training, lying awake in the early hours listening to Ron snore from across the room. He had almost asked twice. Once on a Monday evening when the kitchen was warm and Molly had made shepherd's pie and the light was the particular golden color that autumn light got just before it went, and everything had felt so complete and right that the question had risen in his throat, and then simply not come out because he'd opened his mouth and what he'd actually said was, "Could someone pass the salt?" The second attempt had been abandoned before it properly started. He'd stood up from the sofa with the clear intention of asking Arthur something private, and then Bill had flew in unexpectedly with news about a cursed vault at Gringotts, and the moment had dissolved entirely. Ron knew, Harry had not told him, but Ron had eyes and a chess player's ability to see the board even when no one had pointed it out to him, and he had looked at Harry the morning after the second failed attempt with an expression of almost painful neutral patience that communicated without saying a word that he was not going to ask, that Harry was free to take whatever time he needed, and that Ron's opinion of the matter, if pressed, would have consisted of one word. Hermione also knew. This was not a surprise. Hermione knew most things and the rest she deduced. She had chosen not to say so, which Harry suspected was the most considerate thing she had ever done in her life, and he appreciated it more than he could have articulated. What finally moved him was simpler than either of those moments. It was late on a Wednesday, and he was sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, and he was thinking about Ginny, not about the future or the ring or whether he was doing it right. Just about Ginny specifically, the particular look she had given him across the great hall in the aftermath of the battle, when he had been unable to process much of anything, and she had simply looked at him with an expression that said, "You're here." That was the complete content of the expression. "You're here and I knew you would be, and here is where I'll be too." He put down his tea. He was going to ask Arthur in the morning. Molly had gone to the village. This was not coincidence. Harry had checked the calendar in the kitchen 3 times in the preceding week, and the Saturday morning village trip was as regular as clockwork: market stalls, the apothecary for herbs, the post office for her witch weekly correspondence. Arthur would be in the shed. Harry knew this because Arthur was always in the shed on Saturday mornings, communing with his collection of Muggle electrical items with the devoted attention of a scholar examining primary texts. He knocked on the shed door at 9:30. Come in, Arthur said, not looking up from whatever he was gently dismantling with a screwdriver. The shed smelled of sawdust and something faintly metallic. It was warm despite the autumn morning. Shelves lined every wall, crowded with Muggle objects in various states of investigation. The toaster he had been puzzling over for 6 months, several devices that had once been telephones, a row of batteries he was convinced were magical somehow and simply hadn't been able to prove it yet. Harry, I thought you were Bill. Come in, sit down, there's a stool somewhere under those catalogues. Harry moved the catalogues and sat. There were about 30 seconds of comfortable silence, while Arthur continued to examine his object with the focus of a man who genuinely could not see why anyone would want to be anywhere else, doing anything else at this precise moment. Then Harry put down his mug. I wanted to ask you something, he said, about Ginny. Arthur set down the screwdriver, looked up. His expression was the particular expression of a man who had suspected this conversation was coming for some time and had been quietly ready for it, but who was also, Harry noticed, doing absolutely nothing to make it easier. He simply waited. Harry had prepared something to say. He had rehearsed it, in fact, lying awake on Thursday night, something measured and proper about intentions and the future, and demonstrating that he understood the seriousness of what he was asking. What actually came out of his mouth was rather different. I haven't got a father to come to you, he said. I haven't got anyone who would have told me how to do this. I know that. I know it. I know there are things I probably don't know how to do, things I didn't have anyone to teach me, and I'm going to get things wrong sometimes, and I'm sorry about that in advance. He stopped, started again. I love her. I think I've probably loved her for years, and I was too thick to know what I was looking at. I didn't when you're 11 and someone tells you that you're famous and the world wants a piece of you. It takes a while to work out which pieces are actually yours. She always saw just me, not the scar, not the all of it, just me. I think that's why. He stopped again. I'd like to ask her to marry me if that's all right with you. I know it should be, I know it is, but I wanted to ask you properly. He had not quite finished the sentence. Arthur crossed the shed in 4 strides and embraced him. And Harry, who had steeled himself for almost any response except this immediate one, was briefly unable to do anything at all. Harry, Arthur said into his shoulder, you've been family since you were 12 years old. We've just been waiting for you to notice. His voice was completely steady. His eyes, when he pulled back, were not. He picked up the toaster from the shelf and appeared to examine it with great interest. You'll want to speak to Molly, he said. She'll be home by 11. She's going to cry. I'd prepare yourself. Molly was home by 10 to 11, which suggested she had hurried. She came into the kitchen to find Harry sitting at the table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she took one look at him and put down her bags and filled the kettle. She did not say anything for a moment. She could tell that something was weighing on him and asked, Harry dear, are you all right? He replied that he had something to talk to her about. He stopped. It's the thing I always. Harry cleared his throat, the words sticking like treacle. The kitchen was very quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant lowing of a cow somewhere across the fields. Molly watched him steadily, her hands folded on the scrubbed wooden table. She had always been able to see straight through him, ever since he was a thin, underfed boy who had stumbled into the Burrow all those years ago. There was love in her eyes, fierce and abundant, but there was steel there too, the same steel that had sent howlers across the country and faced down Death Eaters without flinching, for attacking her precious Ginny, her only daughter. Harry drew a deep breath. Molly, he said, his voice low but steady, I love Ginny more than I can say. She makes me feel like I could have a proper life after everything, like I'm not just the boy who lived or whatever's left of that. I want to spend the rest of my life with her. He met her gaze squarely. I'd like your blessing to ask her to marry me. For a long moment Molly said nothing. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her chin lifted in that familiar way, the one that told you she was preparing to defend her family with everything she had. She reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers, her grip warm and surprisingly strong. Oh, Harry, she whispered, her voice thick. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. You've been one of mine for years, dear. There's no one in this world I'd rather see standing beside my Ginny. You have my blessing. She squeezed his hand once, then sat back a little, her expression growing more serious, more motherly. But she is my only daughter, Harry, my girl. I've watched her grow up through laughter and tears and more danger than any child should ever have faced. I need to know that you understand what you're asking of her and of yourself. Molly's eyes held his, kind but unyielding. Tell me properly then, do you understand the life you'd be offering her? Not just the love, but the hard parts too. The times when the world will look at the pair of you and remember who you are. The days when she'll want to fly and you'll want to keep her safe and you'll both have to learn how to do neither completely. Her voice softened but the steel remained. How will you love her, Harry? Not with the grand gestures or saving the world again, but day after day when things are ordinary and quiet and real. She deserves that, she deserves everything. She paused, searching his face as though she might still find some trace of the boy who sleeps in Ron's room. And how will you protect her heart, my dear? Not with your wand or your name, but with your own. Because if you're going to marry Ginny, I need to hear it from you. Real questions, not the soft, easy kind. Molly continued, her voice firm but not unkind. And I need you to remember, Harry dear, that Ginny is still in her final year of Hogwarts. Under no circumstances is that to be interrupted. She'll finish her schooling and sit her NEWTS just like Hermione is doing. Nothing, and I mean nothing, will happen until that is complete, not a wedding at least. Did he understand that Ginny would be finishing her final year at Hogwarts, sitting her NEWTS undisturbed? Yes, of course he did. Did he understand that Quidditch was no passing fancy for her but a serious ambition she had fought hard to claim, currently the Gryffindor Quidditch captain? Yes, he would never ask her to set it aside, nor had he ever considered such a thing. Ginny was not made for a quiet life, and he had long since stopped pretending that he was either. He looked at Molly Weasley across the kitchen table. No, he said honestly, I wouldn't want that for her. She looked at him for a long moment. Why her? He had expected many questions, not that one. She's the first person, he said, who ever looked at me the same way, just the same way you'd look at anyone, not like I was, not because of what I was, just me. He paused. I think I've been looking for that my whole life and I didn't have a word for it until her. She's the first person who made me feel like an ordinary person. I know that sounds small, but it isn't. It's the thing I always, he stopped. It's the thing I always wanted most and never had a name for. 5 seconds of silence. Molly crossed the kitchen and gathered him into an embrace that reorganized something in his chest, something that had been slightly displaced for as long as he could remember, and he held on and let it be reorganized. Welcome to the family, she said. You have always been welcome, but now it's official. She was already crying. By the time she pulled back, she was already at the kettle again, making tea that neither of them needed, because having something to do with her hands was how Molly Weasley managed moments that were too large to simply stand in. The non-negotiable delivered over the fresh tea. Ginny finished school, June, no exceptions. He would not have considered asking otherwise. Arthur appeared in the doorway at some point during this, looked at them both, glanced at Harry with an expression of quiet satisfaction and sat for tea. Enjoying the journey, subscribe for future chapters, and now, let's return to the story. The Burrow was never quiet when any of the Weasleys were home, but on Hogsmeade weekends it took on a particular sort of cheerful chaos that had become its own custom since the war. Ginny had started coming home every other weekend when she could, sometimes with Hermione in tow, as though the familiar walls and the smell of Molly's cooking were the best remedy for the lingering shadows of their final year. This particular Sunday evening was no different, or almost no different. The kitchen, by some collective impulse nobody acknowledged aloud, had filled with people who had perfectly ordinary reasons to be there. Arthur was reading. Hermione sat at the table with what appeared to be a transfiguration essay she was not making any progress on. Ron sat beside her doing nothing at all, in the particular way of someone who has decided that doing nothing at all is entirely normal and requires no explanation. Molly was at the stove. They were all being entirely natural about this, which meant they were being profoundly unnatural in a way that only Ginny, who had grown up with every single one of them, could possibly have missed. She did not miss it. She stepped out of the flue and caught her father's eye. He had the look of a man who had sorted something quietly and was not going to mention it. Harry had owled her Thursday. He had something he needed to tell her, he'd said. He would say more when he saw her. Take the flue from the leaky cauldron rather than the train. Arthur had arranged the connection. She hadn't slept especially well since. She brushed ash from her robes, took in the room with one sweep of her eyes, her mother at the stove, her father reading, Ron doing nothing at all with great purpose, Hermione's essay going nowhere. and her expression did the thing it always did when she understood a situation before anyone else. A brief flash of something like relief contained immediately, present only if you knew to look. She hugged her mother, she hugged her father. She looked at Ron, whose face had arranged itself into an expression of elaborate unconcern so unsuccessful it was almost artistic. She looked at Hermione, who was studying the essay with the dedicated focus of someone who was not studying the essay at all. Then she looked at the back door. Harry was waiting on the other side of it. She could tell without being able to see him, the same way she could always tell. She went. Right, Ginny said when they had reached the far edge of the garden and the sounds from the kitchen had softened to something indistinct. She folded her arms and looked at him. What's going on? Harry opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Ginny's eyebrows rose. You look terrified. I'm not terrified. You are. I'm not. You are. Harry sighed, maybe a bit. Ginny laughed. Merlin's beard, Harry, now you're making me nervous. That wasn't helping. He shoved a hand into his pocket and found the small velvet box exactly where it had been for the last 2 days. He'd had things he meant to say. He'd thought of them at 3 in the morning and had been fairly confident they'd still be there when he needed them. They weren't. They had evaporated entirely, leaving him standing in a cold October garden with the box in his pocket and nothing useful in his head at all. He tried once and stopped, tried again and stopped. I haven't got anyone who would have taught me how to do this properly, he said finally. It came out rougher than he'd intended, and he couldn't tell if the rest of it was going to follow or not. There wasn't, He stopped again. I'm just going to do it, and if it comes out wrong, I hope you'll take it for what it is. He reached into his pocket. Ginny said yes. He looked up. I haven't asked yet. Harry. Right, he said, right. His hands were not entirely steady. He was aware of this as he opened the box, as the sapphire caught what remained of the evening light from the Burrow's windows, deep blue in old silver. He was aware of it as Ginny held out her hand, certain and steady, the way she always was, the way that had always quietly undone him, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fitted. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put her hand against his face, her palm against his jaw, cold from the October air, and he leaned into it without thinking, simply because it was there. They were both laughing, though he couldn't have said when that started. He kissed her. For a moment the garden, the Burrow, and the entire world seemed to disappear. When they finally pulled apart, Ginny looked down at her hand and turned it slightly. The gold caught the last of the light. Look at that, she said. What? You actually managed to surprise me. Only for about 3 seconds. Still counts. The kitchen door burst open. About bloody time. George came striding across the garden, and the rest of the family came with him. Molly was already crying. Hermione had both hands clapped over her mouth. Arthur looked delighted. Bill was grinning. Charlie was grinning. George looked insufferably pleased with himself. Ron, however, had stopped dead halfway across the lawn. His eyes were fixed on Ginny's left hand. Blimey. Nobody paid him any particular attention. Molly had reached them and pulled both Harry and Ginny into a fierce hug. Oh, my dears, she said somewhat wetly. Mum, I knew it. Mum, I absolutely knew it. You were supposed to know it, said Ginny, laughing. Harry asked your permission. Molly looked rather pleased with herself. Ron was still staring. Blimey. Yes, Ron, said Hermione impatiently, it's a ring. I can see it's a ring. Excellent. I'm just saying, Ron pointed, they're getting married. That is usually what a ring means, said Hermione. Ron looked from Harry to Ginny, and back again. His expression suggested he had just discovered something genuinely astonishing about the world. You're getting married, he repeated. That's generally the idea, said Ginny. To Harry. Well, I wasn't planning on marrying Dean Thomas. George choked with laughter. Even Hermione smiled. Ron ignored both of them. Blimey. You've already said that, Hermione told him. Well, it's still true. That finally broke whatever spell had come over him. He strode forward and seized Harry in a crushing hug. You idiot. Thanks, Ron. You could have warned me. I thought everyone already had. Ron pulled back and looked around the garden. Every member of his family suddenly found something else to look at. George was studying the stars. Bill was examining a flower bed. Charlie appeared to have become fascinated by a garden gnome that had appeared near the fence. Realization dawned slowly across Ron's face. Everyone knew. Nobody answered. Ron looked horrified. Everyone knew except me. George doubled over laughing. Ron went scarlet. Oh, he said. Exactly, said Ginny. Bill disappeared inside and came back with bottles, assisted by Arthur, who led them through to a large refrigerator in the back corner of the kitchen that had not, to anyone's knowledge, been there last month. It hummed faintly. Since when do we have a muggle fridge? Ron asked with some suspicion. I adapted it, Arthur said, as though this explained everything, ministry exception. That's not a thing, Hermione said at once. It is now, Arthur replied pleasantly. He opened the door. Inside were neatly arranged bottles of butterbeer, glowing faintly with a cooling charm that looked, to Harry's eye, like it had been reapplied several times with increasing optimism rather than precision. It leaks slightly, Arthur added, but only in a magical sense. That's not reassuring, Ron muttered. But glasses were produced regardless, and within minutes they were all back in the kitchen, the noise rising again like a tide. Harry found himself drawn back to Ginny's side without quite deciding to be there. She bumped her shoulder against his. Still alive, she asked. Barely. Good. Hermione had already reappeared at Ginny's other side, pulling her into another hug. I need to see it again, Hermione said. You've already seen it. Not properly. Ginny held out her hand obligingly. Hermione went still. It really suits you, she said quietly. Ginny tried to look unconcerned and failed entirely. Molly, who had noticed, swept over immediately, and Ginny was absorbed into a careful inspection that turned her this way, and that as though she were a particularly important piece of work that might fall apart if not properly examined. Harry, left momentarily adrift, was clapped on the back by Bill. Well done, Bill said simply. Thanks. Charlie gave him a grin. You picked a good one. She didn't give me much choice, Harry said. Even better, said Charlie. Ron had drifted over with a butterbeer in hand, still watching Ginny with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had received news his brain had not yet fully processed. So Ron said slowly, this is actually happening. Yes, said Harry. You're going to be my brother. I already am, sort of. Ron frowned, yeah, but now it's official weird. Harry laughed. George clinked his bottle loudly against the nearest glass. Right, he announced, toast time before Mum starts crying again. I am not, Mrs. Weasley began, but she was already dabbing her eyes. Arthur raised his glass first. To Harry and Ginny, he said warmly, and to many happy years ahead. To Harry and Ginny came the chorus. Even Ron joined in, a beat behind everyone else. To Harry, he said, and Ginny, then quietly as an afterthought, blimey. The noise eventually began to settle, not because anyone decided it should, but because the Burrow seemed to run out of steam after a certain point. Glasses were half empty. Laughter came in slower bursts. George had stopped clinking his bottle against anything that would tolerate it. Harry found himself drifting back toward the garden door with Ginny, almost without noticing. Just a moment of air. Outside, the garden was quiet again. The orchard stood dark at the far end, the October trees stripped bare against the sky, and behind them the Burrow's windows threw warm yellow light out onto the lawn. Ginny slipped her hand into his as though it had always belonged there. Better, she asked. Much. She glanced sideways at him. You're doing that thing again. What thing? Looking like you've just escaped something. Harry considered this. I think I might have. From inside came the sound of George saying something loudly that made everyone else groan. Ginny smiled. Do you remember, Harry said after a moment, when I used to come round here and everything felt a bit too loud? Ginny snorted softly. It still is. Yeah, he said, but I don't notice it as much now. She glanced at him. That's either maturity or damage. I'll go with maturity. You would. The kitchen door opened behind them. Molly Weasley stood there, arms folded in a way that suggested the celebration phase had officially ended and the practical phase had begun. Arthur hovered just behind her, looking mildly apologetic and faintly pleased with everything at once. "Mum," Ginny said with some caution. Molly looked between them, then at Ginny's hand, then at Harry, then back at Ginny. "I assume," she said carefully, "you've both thought about this properly." "Yes," Ginny said at once. Harry hesitated half a second too long. Molly noticed Harry. "Yes," he said, "yes, I have." "Good." A pause. Arthur cleared his throat gently. "There are just," he said, in the tone of someone trying very hard not to sound like the ministry, "a few practical matters." "Oh no," Ginny muttered. Molly ignored that entirely. "You are still at school," she said firmly. "Yes, Mum. And Harry will be starting aura training." "Eventually," Harry said carefully. Molly's expression softened slightly, though her tone did not. "There is no need to rush anything." Ginny let out a short laugh. "We're not rushing anything." Molly raised an eyebrow. The look alone suggested she had raised 7 children and was not easily convinced by teenagers with rings. Arthur stepped in gently. "What your mother means is that life tends to move quite quickly once you stop paying attention." "That is not what I meant," Molly said at once. "It's close enough," Arthur replied pleasantly. "We're not moving in together tomorrow," Ginny said. Molly nodded once as though this was the correct answer. "Good. You will finish your schooling properly." "Yes, Mum. And there will be no rushing into anything foolish." Ginny looked at Harry. Harry looked back at her. "We're not exactly known for rushing," Ginny said. Harry kept his expression entirely neutral. "It usually finds us first." That earned him a look from Molly, half stern, half reluctant approval. She studied them both for a moment longer, then reached out and briefly squeezed Ginny's hand. The ring caught the light between them. Her expression softened properly this time. "It is very beautiful," she said quietly. Ginny's voice softened too. Harry chose it. Molly looked at him, then he did well. Arthur gave Harry a small, approving nod that felt like its own kind of ceremony. The kitchen door closed behind them. For a moment, Harry and Ginny stood in the quiet garden. The noise of the Burrow continued behind them, softened now, distant. Ginny exhaled slowly. "You survived, Mum." "I think she was being kind." Ginny laughed. Harry glanced at her hand again, still slightly disbelieving. The ring was familiar, the way new things sometimes are when they are also exactly right, not surprising, just clarifying. As though it had been there before and he'd simply not been paying close enough attention. "So," he said, "we're actually doing this." Ginny nudged him with her shoulder. "Yes, eventually." Harry smiled. "Good." Owls went out. Molly had a list, amended 3 times, written in her neat handwriting with additions in Arthur's, Ron's, and Hermione's marginalia. McGonagall, Hagrid, who received his own separate owl because Molly insisted Hagrid deserved to know before anyone else at Hogwarts. Several members of the Old Order. Bill would tell Fleur, Percy at the Ministry. The owls lifted from the Burrow's eaves just before midnight. Harry watched them go from the kitchen window, a dozen shapes dispersing against the dark sky in as many directions. Ginny stood beside him. "It's real now," Harry said. "Was it not real before?" "It was real before." He watched the last owl disappear over the tree line. "Now it's real to everyone else too." She considered this. "That is a meaningful distinction," she said, and he could hear the smile in it without needing to see her face. The kitchen was quiet in the way it only got after a Weasley evening had fully exhausted itself. Someone had done the washing up. The butterbeer bottles were gone. From upstairs came the distant sound of Ron's snoring, which had apparently started the moment his head touched the pillow, because Ron had always had that gift. Harry was at the kitchen table before anyone else was up. He hadn't slept badly, not anxiously, just lightly, the way you sleep when something large has happened and your mind hasn't quite finished with it yet. He'd come downstairs at 6:30 to find the kitchen quiet and the kettle cold, and he'd put it on and sat down and looked at the ring on Ginny's finger in the early light coming through the window. She'd fallen asleep with her chin on her hand, which was not, he reflected, the most comfortable way to sleep, but she seemed entirely unbothered by this, and he'd thought, this is what morning looks like now. He was still thinking this when the first owl came. 6:45. He recognized the handwriting before he'd fully crossed the room, precise, slightly forward-leaning. The bird, a small grey that regarded him with the composed authority of an animal that had delivered considerably more important correspondence than this, and was aware of it. He opened it. Mr. Potter. I received the owl shortly after midnight. I confess it took me approximately 20 minutes to compose myself sufficiently to continue with my evening, which I mention only because I would have expected it to take considerably longer. Miss Weasley is everything I believed her to be when she first walked into my classroom, and considerably more besides. You have chosen well, though I suspect she had something to do with the choosing. With great affection and no small amount of pride, M. McGonagall. P.S. Your parents would have been very proud indeed. I trust you already know that. I wanted to say it plainly regardless. Harry set it down carefully. He was still looking at the postscript when footsteps sounded on the stairs. Ginny appeared in the doorway, still in her dressing gown, hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She stopped when she saw him. A slow smile appeared. Morning, husband. Harry nearly dropped the letter. Ginny looked extremely pleased with herself. I was trying it on, she said, crossing the kitchen and sitting beside him. You nearly gave me a heart attack. Excellent. She leaned comfortably against his shoulder. Now what are you reading? McGonagall's. Ginny immediately straightened. She read it over his shoulder, and he heard her go quiet at the postscript. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He looked at the letter again. The second owl arrived at 7:15. It was enormous, tawny, and flew directly into the window frame before locating the open portion and coming through with considerable dignity, as though this had been entirely intentional. The letter attached to its leg was written on what appeared to be the inside of a Honeyduke's paper bag, in handwriting that was large, urgent, and damp in several places. Dear Harry and Ginny. Got your owl and nearly dropped Fang's breakfast. I remember bringing Harry to Diagon Alley for the first time. I remember him not knowing anything about our world. I remember thinking his mum and dad would have been proud of the way he carried himself. They would have been even prouder today. Ginny, there was never a question in my mind, not once. And Harry, if ye don't know how lucky ye are, I'm sure she'll spend the next 50 years reminding ye. I will be at the gates tonight. I want to see that ring proper. All my love always, Hagrid. Ginny laughed, the kind that started somewhere real and didn't try to stop itself. Harry found he was laughing too. He wrote it on a Honeyduke's bag, Ginny said. It was probably the nearest thing to hand. That's very Hagrid. Yeah, said Harry, it really is. The third owl arrived at 7:30. Small, neat, a bird Harry recognized immediately. He was already sitting forward before he'd opened it. Dear Harry. Your owl arrived before Teddy was awake, which is to say it arrived very early indeed. I sat with it for some time before writing back. I am so glad. I want you to know that simply and without qualification. You deserve every good thing that is coming, and from everything I have seen of Ginny Weasley, she is more than equal to the task of making certain you receive it. Nymphadora would have been so pleased, Remus too. I think you know that already, but some things deserve to be said plainly. Teddy's hair has been going red at the end since September. I thought you should know. With love, Andromeda. Harry read it twice, then he folded it and set it on top of McGonagall's very carefully and looked at the table. Ginny didn't say anything. She reached across and covered his hand with hers and left it there. Teddy's hair, Harry said finally. I know, said Ginny. The fourth owl arrived just after 8, slightly out of breath, the envelope sealed before the ink was entirely dry. Hermione's handwriting was neat as ever, but the speed showed in the slight forward lean, sentences running closer together than usual. Harry, I have written 3 pages to Ginny and I am not apologizing for that. I shall spare you a second version. I am very happy for both of you. I suspect you already know that. All my love, Hermione. P.S. The 3 pages were entirely enthusiastic. The second page was Wizarding Marriage Law. This is also enthusiasm. P.P.S. Ron says congratulations and claims he was perfectly calm about all of this. This is not true. She sent you a short one, Ginny said, reading over his shoulder. She sent you 3 pages, Harry said. I got the summary. Ginny smiled. That's almost a compliment. Ron's postscript is accurate, though. Ginny laughed extremely. The kitchen filled gradually around them. Arthur appeared first, still doing up a cuff, stopped in the doorway when he saw the letters spread across the table and nodded once with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had arranged something and was pleased with how it had gone. George wandered in, looked at the two of them sitting shoulder to shoulder, announced that it was revolting and stole a piece of toast. Ron appeared last, hair pointing in several directions, looked at Harry, looked at Ginny, looked at the letters. Still engaged, then. Morning, Ron, said Ginny. Ron opened a cupboard, just checking. Molly appeared at 9:30. She took one look at them both still at the table, at the 4 letters arranged neatly in front of them, and pressed her lips together in the particular way that meant she had decided not to cry, and was finding this decision difficult to honor. She reached for the kettle instead. Right, she said, breakfast. A breath then, with the tone of a woman who had raised 7 children and knew when a moment needed a firm hand. You've got a train to catch, Ginny. Ginny squeezed Harry's hand under the table. Neither of them moved immediately. She had to be back at Hogwarts that evening. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 on Sunday morning, and Ginny was on it. She had the compartment to herself for the first hour, which she used to look out the window at the fields going past and feel the ring on her finger and think, in an unfocused way, about the fact that her life had changed last night. Not enormously, not in ways she could fully see yet, but something had settled, as if a question she hadn't realized she'd been asking had been answered. She was not the sort of person who needed to examine the answer extensively in order to know it was right. Luna found her at Bristol. She came into the compartment trailing her copy of the Quibbler and her habitual air of serene disconnection from the immediate world, sat down across from Ginny, looked at her face, looked at her left hand, and then looked out of the window with an expression of complete tranquility. "You're happy in a different way than usual," she observed. "Am I?" "It's a more settled kind of happy, like something has found where it was going." Luna turned back from the window. "The ring is very beautiful. Sapphires have a good energy." "Very true." Ginny smiled. "I think he chose it for the color, actually." "That's the same thing," Luna said, and returned to the Quibbler. Neville was in the corridor between Taunton and Exeter. He looked at her face when she came out of the compartment for some air, and then at her hand, and then back at her face. He was very quiet for a moment. "When," he said, "last night." "Good," said Neville. One word, he left it exactly there. Ginny had always liked that about Neville, his uncanny ability to say precisely the right amount and not a syllable more. She suspected it was a quality that had developed through years of forcing himself to speak up when he was frightened, and had, somewhere along the way, transformed into the rarest kind of confidence, the confidence of someone who simply knows when something is enough. Hagrid was at the gates. She hadn't expected that, or she had, actually, the moment she thought about it, which was why she wasn't surprised when the great dark shape detached itself from the shadow of the gatehouse and came toward them before the carriage had fully stopped. He reached them as all 3 came through the gates together, and his great hand came down briefly on Neville's shoulder. "Neville, good to see ye," then to Luna with genuine warmth, "Luna, love." "Hello, Hagrid," said Luna pleasantly. She looked at Ginny, then at the ring, then back at Hagrid with the serene accuracy of someone completing a very simple calculation. Hagrid jerked his great head toward the castle. "Go on ahead, you two, I'll just be a minute." "Of course," said Luna, as though this were perfectly obvious, and walked on without another word. Neville gave Ginny one look, not at Hagrid, not at the ring, just at Ginny, that said everything it needed to, and followed Luna up toward the castle. Hagrid watched them go with the expression of a man who had always had a great deal of time for both of them. Then he turned back to Ginny, and his face did the thing it had clearly been doing since Molly's owl arrived that morning. "Rig, then," he said, "let's have a look at ye." Ginny held out her hand. Hagrid took it in both of his, carefully, the way he handled things he considered precious and was very aware of his own size around, and looked at the ring for a long moment without saying anything. "Sapphire," he said finally. "He chose it himself." "Course he did," a sound somewhere between a laugh and something not quite a laugh. "That's him, thar is." "Are you going to cry on it?" I'm not. He released her hand hastily, and the handkerchief appeared from somewhere about his person, the size of a small tablecloth. I'm not crying. You're absolutely crying. There's something in my Hagrid. I'm very happy for ye, he said with great dignity from behind the handkerchief. The both of ye, since before he knew he was Harry I've known him. And you, he stopped, gave up on words entirely and simply gathered her into a hug that made the rest of the world briefly inaccessible. Ginny laughed into his shoulder and let him. Rig, he said finally, setting her back on her feet. He applied the handkerchief one last time, entirely unself-consciously. Go on then, McGonagall's up at the steps. Right, said Ginny, thanks, Hagrid. Don, thank me, a pause like something he'd been saving. Tell him I'm proud of him. Ginny's smile softened, I will. She went, behind her she could hear him blow his nose with a sound like a foghorn, entirely unbothered by any of it. McGonagall was on the entrance steps. She was not obviously waiting. She stood at the top as she might reasonably be on any Sunday evening, reviewing matters of administrative importance. A few returning students received nods as they passed. One received a pointed comment about the state of their robes. But she had positioned herself where she had a clear view of every student coming up from the gates. And when her gaze found Ginny, there was a precision to it that suggested the rosters were not, in fact, the primary reason she was there. She came down 2 steps, which brought her to Ginny's eye level. Miss Weasley. Professor. Ginny smiled. Your letter was beautiful. For a moment, McGonagall looked almost caught off guard. Thank you. A brief silence followed. Then, I am very glad. The words were careful, genuine, the particular warmth McGonagall produced when she had thought about something and decided it deserved to be said exactly. He waited an appropriate amount of time. 3 weeks, Ginny said. He had the ring for 3 weeks. Something shifted very briefly in McGonagall's expression. Only 20 minutes, she said, which Ginny understood without explanation. She meant from when the owl had arrived to when McGonagall had composed herself sufficiently to continue her morning. I would have expected it to take longer. Ginny laughed softly. McGonagall inclined her head. Then she turned and went back up the steps. Ginny watched her go, oddly moved. Hermione's letter was waiting on her pillow. This was so entirely Hermione that Ginny sat on the bed and read it with something between fondness and exasperation. The first page was genuinely warm and personal, and exactly right. The second page Ginny read with the tolerant recognition of someone who knew that Hermione expressed love through information. She folded it up and put it in her trunk. She went to the owlery at midnight. It was cold up there, colder than the corridors, and smelled of feathers and old wood and the particular dry dustiness that owleries always smelled of. She wrote to Harry not a long letter, just a few lines. Arrived safely, Luna noticed immediately. Neville said good and left it there. Hagrid was at the gates and cried on her hand and told her to tell him he was proud of him. McGonagall was on the steps, 20 minutes, apparently, before she could continue her evening, though she seemed almost embarrassed it hadn't been longer. Hermione truly did send 3 pages, and I love her. She attached it to the leg of one of the school owls, a large, tawny one who looked at her with yellow eyes and the dignified patience of an animal that had delivered considerably more dramatic correspondence than this. Go on then, she said. The owl departed into the dark. She watched it until the darkness swallowed it, then went back inside. She was asleep before it had cleared the forest. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the journey, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next chapter. Until then, take care.